There were 4,200 people packed into the Jasper County Fairgrounds on a Saturday in late August of 2019, and the majority of them had already made up their minds about the woman standing next to the 1963 Peterbilt 281 in Lane 3. The truck was rust orange along the cab corners and faded to something closer to primer along the hood and the chrome on the stacks, both of them straight pipes rising behind the cab like a pair of old fence posts, had gone the color of old pewter in the places where it hadn't gone the color of nothing at all. The lettering on the door had been repainted by hand, not by a shop, and if you stood close enough you could see the brush strokes. The woman standing next to it was 34 years old, and her name was Cassie Durnan, and she had driven that truck 61 miles from a gravel lot outside of Renner, Iowa, on a Saturday morning in August when the air was already thick enough to taste. The rig in Lane 2 belonged to a performance shop out of Des Moines called Apex Diesel Fabrication, and it was a purpose-built pulling truck that had cost somewhere between $380,000 and $400,000, depending on which version of the story you believed, and both versions were probably right. It had a matching crew of 4, matching shirts, matching hats, a matching trailer with a matching generator, running matching lights on the matching equipment inside. The crew chief was a man named Garrett Hollis, 41 years old, broad through the shoulders, and he had the look of someone who assessed things for a living and had already assessed this situation. He looked at the 281 the way a surgeon looks at a folk remedy. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Someone in the crowd laughed. Not cruelly, exactly, the way people laugh when they feel safe in a shared opinion. Now, I need to stop here and explain something, because without this, the rest of the story doesn't make sense. The 1963 Peterbilt 281 was not a pulling truck. It was not built to be a pulling truck. It had never been marketed as a pulling truck. It was a long-haul freight machine designed for the interstate era before the interstate era was fully complete, built in a factory in Newark, California, and sold to a man named Roland Durnan, Cassie's grandfather, in the spring of 1964 for $9,400, which was a significant sum of money in 1964, and which Roland had paid in 2 installments because he didn't believe in financing anything he wasn't absolutely certain he could pay off before the bank had time to think about it. Roland drove that truck for 22 years. He drove it through the farm crisis of the early 80s, when half the men in his county were selling equipment they'd owned for decades to pay debts they'd accumulated in the optimistic 70s. And he kept the truck because he said it was the one thing he owned that had never lied to him. He said that once, at a kitchen table, in the winter of 1987, and Cassie was 6 years old and sitting across from him eating oatmeal, and she remembered it the way you remember things you didn't know yet that you would need. But first, I need to tell you about Cassie Durnan, because without knowing who she was, the rest of this story is just a truck at a county fair. Cassie grew up on the Durnan property outside Renner, which was 312 acres of corn and soybean ground that her grandfather had bought in pieces over 40 years, and which her father, Dale, had farmed since Roland's knees gave out in 1989. Dale was a careful farmer and a decent mechanic and a man who understood that the truck in the equipment shed was a family artifact, which meant he maintained it without ever quite believing it was his to use. He changed the oil, he kept the fuel system clean, he ran it around the property roads twice a year to keep the seals from drying out. But Dale was also a practical man, And when Cassie was 16 and asked if she could learn to drive it, Dale said yes. And when she was 18 and asked if she could start working on the engine, Dale said yes to that too. And then he stepped back, because Dale Durnan was smart enough to know when someone had found the thing they were supposed to find. Cassie took an automotive program at the community college in Ames and finished it in 18 months, and then went to work at a diesel shop in Ankeny that specialized in older commercial equipment, the kind of place that still had a wall of service manuals going back to the 1950s and an owner who had been rebuilding Cummins NHC engines since before Cassie was born. His name was Merle Haas, and he was 67 when Cassie started working for him, and he had the hands of someone who had spent 50 years inside engines, and the patience of someone who had spent 50 years explaining engines to people who didn't understand them yet. He took one look at Cassie's work in the first week and stopped explaining things she already knew. He started explaining the things she didn't, which was a shorter list every year. She worked for Merle for 9 years. She bought a house outside Renner, 12 minutes from the farm, and she drove a 2001 Ford F250 that she had bought for $4,200 and maintained herself. She had no debt. She had a savings account that she added to every month without fail and never touched except for tools. She had a dog named Ditch who slept against the back tire of the 281 on warm evenings, and she had a calendar on the kitchen wall that she used to track the truck's maintenance intervals, and she had a notebook in the glove box of the 281 with 31 years of fluid changes, belt replacements, and fuel system notes written in 3 different handwriting styles: Roland's, then Dale's, then hers. She had been thinking about the Jasper County Pull for 3 years before she entered it. She had watched 2 previous years from the grandstands. She had measured the track, spoken to the officials, and read the rules 3 times. She had not told her father she was entering until 6 weeks before the event, and Dale had not said, "Don't do it." He had said, "Make sure the front axle is right," and she had said, "I know, Dad," and he had said, "I know you know." Now, here is something worth knowing about the 281, because this is the part that Garrett Hollis and his 4-man crew in their matching shirts did not see coming. The engine in a 1963 Peterbilt 281 from the factory was a Cummins NHC 250, a naturally aspirated inline 6-cylinder producing around 250 horsepower and, more importantly, around 650 foot-pounds of torque at a very low RPM. That engine was designed to pull freight, not to accelerate freight, not to race freight, to pull it steadily at a speed that covered ground without drama, in the kind of country where drama was considered a character flaw. The NHC was a long-stroke engine, which means the piston travels a long distance inside the cylinder on each revolution, which means it develops its power down low in the RPM range, which means it doesn't need to be spinning fast to be producing force. I need you to stay with me here, because this is the intellectual key to everything that happened on that track. In a truck pull, the sled, the weighted machine that creates drag, uses a progressive resistance system. As the truck moves down the track, weight transfers forward on the sled, increasing the load on the truck. At the beginning of the pull, the load is manageable. At the end of the pull, the load is enormous. The question is not which truck can make the most noise or reach the highest RPM. The question is which truck can sustain force under increasing load without losing traction and without the engine falling out of its power band. High-horsepower engines that produce their power at high RPM are spectacular at the start and often struggle at the end, because when the load gets heavy enough to slow the engine, it drops below the RPM, where it makes its power, and the power disappears. Low RPM torque engines don't have this problem in the same way, because they were never trying to spin fast in the first place. Their power band is down where the load lives. What Cassie had done to the 281's NHC250 over 3 years of careful work was this. She had rebuilt the bottom end with new bearings and a careful bore job. She had fitted an injector set from a later NHC 335 with modified timing. She had added a single turbocharger, a used Holset HX35 that she had rebuilt herself on the workbench in Merle Haas's shop, and she had tuned the fuel delivery by hand on a dyno over 4 separate sessions until the torque curve was as flat and wide as a river in flood. She had not chased peak horsepower. She had never been interested in peak horsepower. She was interested in the torque at 200 revolutions per minute below where most engines start to feel it, and she had found it, and she had kept it, and she had built the rest of the truck around keeping it. The total cost of the build, parts and machine work and her own labor valued at nothing, was $11,200. She had paid cash. Garrett Hollis's rig had a purpose-built pulling engine producing somewhere north of 2,000 horsepower. It was a spectacular machine. It was exactly what it looked like. The morning of the pull, Cassie arrived at 6:45. She parked in the staging area, shut the engine down, and walked around the truck twice with her hand trailing along the body panels the way you touch something you know exactly. She checked the front axle. She checked the turbo oil feed. She checked the chain hook on the front frame rail, which she had reinforced with a gusset plate welded on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks prior. She drank coffee from a thermos and did not speak to anyone for 40 minutes. Not because she was unfriendly, but because there was nothing that needed saying yet. Ditch was not at the fairgrounds. Ditch was at the farm, because Cassie had left him there with her father, who had driven up that morning in his own truck and parked in the second row of the grandstands without telling Cassie he was coming. Dale Durnan was 63 years old, and he had not said much about the pull in the 6 weeks since Cassie had told him about it, but he had driven 40 minutes and parked in the second row, and he had a thermos of his own, and he sat with his hands around it and watched his daughter walk around the 281 in the staging area below. There was a boy at the fence near the staging area, maybe 9 years old, wearing a red cap that was too big for him. He had been watching Cassie for 20 minutes when he finally said, through the fence, "Which one's going to win?" Cassie looked at him for a moment. She said, "That one," and pointed at the 281. The boy looked at the 281, and then at the apex rig, and then back at Cassie. He said, "Really?" She said, "Really?" He considered this information with the seriousness it deserved, and then nodded and went back to watching. The amateur classes ran first through the morning, and the crowd filled in through the afternoon. And by the time the modified unlimited class was announced, the grandstands were full, and the fence line was 3 and 4 people deep in places. The temperature had climbed to 88 degrees by 2 in the afternoon, and the air carried the smell of cut grass and diesel exhaust, and the particular sweetness of compacted clay that has been sitting in August sun. The track surface was firm and dry, which mattered. Dry clay holds traction differently than wet clay. In dry clay, the tire has to work to find its grip, and a tire that spins even once in dry clay loses the surface it was using and has to find it again. And in a pull, the moment you spend finding your traction is the moment the sled is adding weight. 3 trucks ran before Cassie's class. Two of them were well-built regional rigs that pulled respectable distances and drew genuine applause. The third was a modified diesel that had been overbuilt on top and underbuilt on the bottom, and it smoked badly from the first 50 feet and pulled up short at 180, and the crowd was polite about it. Garrett Hollis went in the class ahead of Cassie's. His rig was announced with sponsor names, and the crowd responded to the sound of the engine at startup the way crowds always respond to that kind of sound. Loudly, immediately, with the pleasure of something spectacular. The Apex truck launched with authority, the front end rising slightly under the torque load, the rear tires biting into the clay and throwing a small rooster tail that the crowd appreciated. It moved down the track with the confidence of a machine that had been designed for exactly this, and it pulled through to 263 feet before the sled resistance exceeded what the engine could sustain at the RPM it needed, and the rear tires broke loose and the run was called. 263 feet. It was a strong pull. The crowd knew it was a strong pull. Garrett Hollis stepped out of the cab, and the crew surrounded him, and the number went up on the board, and it sat there like a challenge. 263 feet. Cassie was staged at the line when the track crew finished resetting. She had the window down. The engine was running at idle, which in an NHC 250 with a Holset turbo is not a quiet idle. It is a low, particular, deliberate sound, the kind of sound that has weight in it even at rest, and several people near the fence turned toward it before the announcer said her name. The announcer said her name and the truck number and said she was running a 1963 Peterbilt 281, and there was a pause in the grandstands, and then a murmur, and then the particular kind of laughter that is not mean, but is absolutely certain. A 1963 Peterbilt 281. Someone near the fence said, "Is that thing even going to make it down the track?" Someone else said, "She's got guts, I'll give her that." These were not said quietly. Cassie heard them. She put her hand flat on the top of the steering wheel and looked down the track and did not react, because she had been inside this engine for 3 years, and she knew exactly what it was going to do, and the crowd did not. And that was the whole story in a single moment. The hookup took 90 seconds. The chain crew ran the pull chain back to the hitch on the 281's rear frame, and when the slack came out of the chain, there was the sharp metallic note that always comes when a chain goes from loose to loaded. A single, clean sound like a bell struck once, and the sled settled against the truck's weight, and the track went quiet in the way that tracks go quiet just before something either happens or doesn't. Cassie brought the engine up in RPM slowly, not quickly. The turbo came in. You could hear the note change, the exhaust sound tightening and rising slightly as the boost built. And then she released the clutch with the precision of someone who had driven this truck for 16 years and knew exactly where the engagement point lived, and the 281 moved. It did not lunge. It did not spin the tires. It did not make the sound that the Apex truck had made, the sound of something being asked to do more than it wanted to. The 281 moved the way a draft horse moves when it leans into a collar for the first time, with a kind of settled, certain commitment, the weight transferring back through the chassis, the front axle rising a fraction and then settling as the rear tires found the clay and held it. The exhaust stacks sent up a column of dark smoke that went straight up in the still air, and the engine note climbed through the lower registers and stayed there. Not screaming, not straining, just working. The way it was built to work. At 50 feet, the crowd was still laughing, not all of them, but enough. At 100 feet, the laughter was quieter. The truck was still moving at the same pace it had started, which was the thing that didn't make sense to people who hadn't been paying attention to what I told you about the torque curve. The sled was adding weight, the load was increasing, and the 281 was pulling at the same cadence it had started with. The engine note unchanged, the rear tires pressed into the clay without drama, the front axle tracking straight down the center of the lane. At 150 feet, the laughter was gone. At 200 feet, the grandstands were standing. Not all of them, but most of them. Dale Durnan was not standing. He was sitting with both hands around his thermos, and his jaw was set, and he was watching his daughter's truck move down the track with the expression of a man who has known something for a long time and is watching the world catch up to it. At 225 feet, the engine note changed. Not a drop, a deepening. The turbo boost was at its peak, and the fuel delivery was doing exactly what Cassie had tuned it to do on 4 separate dyno sessions, and the torque was there, at the bottom of the curve, where the load was heaviest, where it had always been, where she had put it on purpose. The rear tires pressed deeper into the clay. You could see the clay curl up at the edges of the tire contact patch the way soil curls up at the edge of a plow blade, and the truck did not slow down. At 250 feet, the grandstands were loud. A different kind of loud than they'd been for the Apex truck. That had been the loud of spectacle. This was the loud of something being understood. At 263 feet, the number on the board, Garrett Hollis's number, the benchmark, the 281 was still moving. Not fast, not dramatically, but moving, with the chain tight and the sled loaded, and the clay doing its honest work and the engine doing its honest work, and none of it lying about what it was. The crowd understood what 264 feet meant. They understood it the way you understand something when you've been watching it build for 263 feet of preparation. The roar that came out of the Jasper County Fairgrounds grandstands at 264 feet was not polite. It was not the sound of people being impressed. It was the sound of people being corrected, loudly and completely, about something they had been wrong about, and finding that they did not mind being wrong at all. The 281 pulled to 290 feet before the rear tires finally broke traction, a slow, sideways drift that Cassie corrected once and then let go when the run was called. And the truck came to a stop, and the chain went slack, and the crowd was still making noise when Cassie shut the engine down and sat for a moment in the cab in the sudden quiet. 290 feet, 27 feet past the best pull of the day, 27 feet past the purpose-built machine with the 4-man crew and the matching shirts and the $400,000 of engineering that had been designed to do exactly this, and had done it well, and had still come up 27 feet short. She climbed down from the cab. She did not raise her hands. She did not perform anything. She walked to the front of the truck and crouched down and looked at the front tires, checking the wear pattern on the outside edge the way she always did after a hard pull, because the front axle geometry on a 63 Peterbilt is a known variable, and she monitored it. She was still crouching there when Garrett Hollis walked over. He stood next to the truck for a moment. He looked at the engine compartment, which Cassie had left open for cooling. He looked at the turbo, which was still ticking as it cooled. He looked at Cassie. He said, "What's the injector timing?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the NHC 335 set." She said yes. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has just understood something he should have seen earlier, and he walked back to his crew without another word. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. One of the young men from the Apex crew, 23 or 24 years old, approached Cassie alone, without his crew chief, about 20 minutes later. He asked if he could look at the turbo setup. She said yes. He spent 10 minutes looking at it without touching anything, asking 2 questions, both of them good questions. She answered them both completely. He thanked her and went back to the trailer, and she watched him go, and she thought about Merle Haas, who had done the same thing for her 9 years ago, and she thought that was probably how it was supposed to work. Dale Durnan came down from the grandstands after the class was finished. He walked across the infield to where the 281 was staged, and he put his hand on the hood the way his father had put his hand on the hood, and he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Front axle looked good." Cassie said, "I know, Dad." He said, "I know you know." He tapped the hood twice with the flat of his hand and went back to his truck to get the other thermos, the one he'd brought for her, and that was all. The 281 drove back to Renner that evening. Cassie left at 6:15 after the remaining classes finished, after she had loaded her tools and checked the oil and walked around the truck one more time. The drive back was 61 miles on roads she knew. The engine ran the way it always ran. Low, deliberate, pulling against the air with the patience of something that had been doing this since before the interstate was finished, since before Cassie was born, since before Dale was born, since Roland Durnan paid $9,400 in 2 installments because he didn't believe in financing anything he wasn't certain he could pay off. The truck is still on the property outside Renner. It still runs. Cassie drove it to the co-op and back last spring to move a load of seed corn, because it is a truck and that is what trucks are for, and the rust on the cab corners is still there and the chrome on the stacks is still the color of old pewter, and the places where it hasn't gone the color of nothing, and none of that has changed because none of that needed to. Merle Haas retired from the diesel shop in Ankeny in the fall of 2020, and Cassie went to his retirement party and brought him a bottle of whiskey and sat with him for 2 hours at a table in the back of the room, and they talked about injector timing and the particular character of long-stroke engines and the way that knowledge moves from one person to another if the people involved are paying attention. Merle said he always knew she'd figure it out. She said he was the one who showed her where to look. He said that's not the same thing as figuring it out. She said she knew. He said he knew she knew. The boy in the red cap, the one at the fence who asked which one was going to win. She doesn't know his name. She didn't ask. But if you were there, if you were 9 years old and wearing a red cap that was too big for you, and you asked a woman at the fence which truck was going to win, and she pointed at the old rust-orange Peterbilt and said that one, and she was right. You know who you are, and you know what you saw, and there's a chance that what you saw that afternoon is still doing something inside you that you haven't finished understanding yet. That's how it works with things like this. They take time. The good ones always do. If you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that this is the kind of story I look for. Not the story of the loudest thing in the room, but the story of the thing in the room that knew something the loudest thing didn't. There are more of these stories than most people realize. They happen in county fairgrounds and equipment sheds and gravel lots and diesel shops in towns you've never heard of. And they happen quietly, and they almost never get recorded. And that is exactly why I'm here. If you know a story like this one, a machine that wasn't supposed to compete, a person who wasn't supposed to win, a piece of knowledge that got passed down through a family or a shop or a handshake, drop it in the comments. I read every single one of them. I have followed up on more than a few. The next story on this channel may have started in a comment on this video And I mean that without any exaggeration. If you're new here, the subscribe button is below this video. And what you're subscribing to is not a channel about trucks. It's a channel about the people who understand them, and the difference between those two things is everything. Every week there's another story about someone who did the quiet work when nobody was watching and then went and proved it in front of 4,000 people who had already made up their minds. Stories like this one don't survive unless somebody passes them on. Cassie Durnan did not enter that poll for recognition. She entered it because she had spent 3 years building something she believed in, and she wanted to find out if she was right. She was right. The ground told her so. And the ground, as it turns out, does not care what something cost. It just tells you what it is.